All right, folks, welcome on back to the College Super Picks podcast. The season is officially over. Congratulations to the Michigan Wolverines, who are your 2023-2024 season national champions. They win up against future conference opponent in the Washington Huskies. Good job to the Huskies. What a season. 14-1. The best team in the Pac-12 conference, which was the best it had been in a really long time, which is fitting in its final season. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about some of my preseason predictions and going over them, seeing how much I was wrong, and maybe if I got some things right anywhere on in the season. These are my preseason record predictions for the SEC. If you guys like this one enough, I'll do all the other conferences, reviewing what my predictions were for the Big Ten, ACC, Pac-12, whatever conferences are next. I'll do that. But we're going to start off with Alabama. In these preseason predictions, I did only include the regular season and the conference championship, so no bowl games or national championship predictions were added into these preseason predictions. Starting off with Alabama, I had the Crimson Tide going 11-1, and that's exactly what happened in the regular season. They ended up winning the conference and then losing in the first round. Overtime loss to the Michigan Wolverines. They finished 12-2 in their final year under Nick Saban. Probably going to be the end of a legacy at Alabama. Kalen DeBoer is a very solid head coach. He definitely knows how to win. But the Alabama dominance era is over. What a season, though. That first loss to Texas, followed by that bad game against South Florida, really got fans worrying about Alabama, that this was not going to be their year. They were just going to tank. But they ended up having an incredible season, and at one point they looked like possibly the favorites for the national championship after they beat Georgia. But they did get beat by Michigan in overtime. Still, what a season from Nick Saban in his final year. Alabama with a big 12-win season. And honestly, 11-1 was not a bad prediction by me. I actually got the entire regular season correct. So, also, as we go on through this episode, be sure to keep in mind that these were my picks all the way back at the beginning of the season, and nobody's going to be perfect. Next up is the Auburn Tigers, and I hit the nail on the head with this one too. I said the Tigers weren't going to have as good of a season as they had been back in the 2010s. It's been a rough go for Auburn so far in the 2020s, and it was exactly that. They had a big loss to New Mexico State. They just did not have a good season. I believe I said 6-6. And that's exactly what it was. They also lost in their bowl game to Talia Tagovailoa and the Maryland Terrapins. It was a tough year at the quarterback position for Auburn, and their running back room, which was one of the better ones in the SEC, just was unable to carry them as much as it should have. So, just wasn't a good year for Hugh Freeze in his first year at the helm, and hopefully Auburn can pick things up soon, because that fan base, they really need a good season after just a couple of really rough years for the Auburn Tigers. This one's a little rough, and that's the Arkansas Razorbacks. Obviously, Rocket Sanders was not healthy, and that was a huge part of their loss of success this year. Only going 4-8, they did have that win against Florida, which kind of saved their conference record from being abysmal. I had them at 7-5. I said, despite their hard schedule, that they were going to pull out a good season. That's not what happened. Their receiving core was abysmal. The running back room was depleted without Rocket Sanders. And KJ Jefferson still had an extremely solid season, but it was his worst of the years he had started at Arkansas. Sam Pittman is, of course, in the hot seat there. They did not have a good 2023. And with a new transfer quarterback coming in, KJ Jefferson went out. Rocket Sanders transferred out. I don't think it'll get much better next year for the Razorbacks. I had LSU doing big things in 2023. I said Jaden Daniels was going to take a big step up. The Tigers were going to get a statement win on the road against Alabama, and they would only slip up in a tough one against Ole Miss. But that's kind of what happened. Jaden Daniels had an incredible season. The offense was probably the best in the country, but the defense was abysmal. In a roster that looked pretty stacked on the defensive side of the ball for LSU, they did not play well on defense. The offense played better than expected, but they had a tough start to the year because of how their defense struggled. They dropped one in week 1 in what was a blowout loss to Florida State. They still lost to Ole Miss, like how I had predicted, and they also did not win against Alabama. They did play exceptionally well against about half of their schedule. They were blowing out teams. When the defense could do anything, the offense was scoring 50, 60 points. Jaden Daniels was doing his thing. Of course, he won the Heisman. They also won their bowl game narrowly without Jaden Daniels. So LSU could be in this same spot next year with 10-plus wins, but I'd say they a little bit underperformed what I thought they were going to do. It is certainly clear that Lane Kiffin has built an incredible team around him, mainly through the transfer portal at Ole Miss, and that's why I had them improving from their 2022 season and having a 9-3 record, and they even exceeded that as Jackson Dart and Queenshawn Judkins led the Rebels to an 11-2 record, an impressive bowl game win over Penn State. They had a close win over my Aggies. They had a close win over LSU. They had a tough one against Alabama and a blowout loss to Georgia. But other than that, all their wins were comfortable, and they really had a nice season on both offense and defense. And I think the Rebels could be in this same spot next year, as they're returning a lot of talent, and of course they're bringing in a ton of transfers. I called it in the preseason that moving away from the air raid offense was not the right play for Mississippi State. I had them missing a bowl game and going 5-7, and that's exactly what happened. They immediately fired their coach after only one season. Will Rogers struggled with injury and just did not have as good of a year as he did in 2021 or even 2022. Jaquavius Marks battled injury, and he was one of the better running backs in the SEC. He just had never gotten any carries prior to this season, and injury really bumped him out of having a breakout year. But Mississippi State really had a rough season. Honestly, they were losing games worse than I even thought they would in the preseason. Definitely not a good year for the Bulldogs, and they might not be any farther ahead of this next year, as the quarterback play is going to be worse than before, and they lost a lot of guys to the portal, and they're testing out a new coach, so may not be a good year for the Bulldogs. Here they are, my fighting Texas A&M Aggies, and I'm going to be honest, it was a rough year. Going 7-6, the bowl game doesn't really count because all of the players that were in the portal. Of course, Jimbo got fired. They lost a few close games, but really the only big win was were blowouts against small group of 5 FCS schools, and the huge win over Mississippi State that, funny enough, was Jimbo's final game as a head coach at Texas A&M. The future seems decently bright, and I think the Aggies will have a better year in 2024 than they did in 2023 or 2022, but it may not be time just yet that they reach the heights that they were expected to reach under Jimbo Fisher. It was a hot start followed by a horrible finish for Florida. Starting off 5-2, they were in the top 25 a few times, but they lost 5 straight games, just dropping game after game. If they hadn't lost that Arkansas game, they would have been a lot better than it looked, but that's kind of where I had them, just not having the best season. Graham Mertz was better than expected, but the rest of the team was a little bit of a mess. Florida, they may not get any better next year with a pretty tough schedule. It's not another team just like Auburn. The 2020s have not been kind to the Florida Gators, and that needs to change soon because this fan base needs a good season, and that may not come as soon as 2024. Florida, they definitely have gone through a rough patch, and 2023 was part of that. The Georgia Bulldogs, the 2-time national champions, I had them going 13-0, undefeated, winning the SEC. I said Carson Beck wasn't going to be a problem. Stetson Bennett wasn't that special, and he led them to 2 straight natties, and that's exactly what happened. They were perfect inside of the regular season. The only close games they had were against pretty bad teams, honestly, in Auburn and Georgia Tech, and even Missouri was a little close. But other than that, they stormed through their schedule. And then they were shocked by Alabama, and because of how there have been a lot of really good teams this year, they missed the playoffs. Then they embarrassed a Florida State team that wasn't even Florida State, and they finished 13-1. I'd say I hit the nail on the head with this one. In my playoff predictions, I had Georgia making the national championship, but being knocked out by Ohio State. Yes, that's going to be another different story when I look at those predictions. But the Bulldogs still had an incredible season, and they were still probably the best team on paper in 2023. It was the same season as always for Kentucky. Mark Stoops started off by bringing in a transfer quarterback and a transfer running back, and they ended up going 7-6. They had good wins against teams like Florida and a huge win on the road against a 10-1 Louisville team, but overall, just the same season as always for Kentucky. They're usually one of the most under-the-radar teams in the SEC. Nothing crazy, but they're never at the bottom of the SEC. They're always middle of the pack, which is a gift and a curse for the Wildcats. And it's probably going to be more of the same next year, if you had to ask me. This one just makes me cringe every time I think about it. I had Missouri going 4-8. I said Brady Cook and maybe a few others would battle injuries, and it just wasn't going to be their year. And that's exactly the opposite of it. Everyone was healthy. It was their year. Going 10-2 in the regular season, only losing 2 games, and even then, I still didn't believe in them. Over the course of the year in my week-by-week picks, I picked against Missouri 5 times, and they still kept winning, especially in their bowl game, as funny enough, the team I picked to go 4-8 beat the team that I picked to win the national championship. Gosh, how does that work? Anyway, I'm not going to make this one any longer. I've talked about this one before on this podcast. I had them being really bad, and they ended up being really good. Gosh, it was a disappointing year for the Gamecocks. They kind of covered it up with some decent wins at the end of the year, blew out Vanderbilt, but it was just a bad year. It was rough. Other than Spencer Rattler, they didn't have any... Yeah, Spencer Rattler and Xavier Legette, where everything else was a mess. Of course, Juice Wells was injured for pretty much the entire year. He was going to be the key to their offense, and that was not it. I wasn't as high on them as most people were, but they did not have a good year. They did not make a bowl game. They went on a little 3-game win streak, as I said, but other than that, it was a tough season for the Gamecocks. Tennessee wasn't as good as I thought, but I wasn't as wrong as I thought I was going to be. If that makes sense, Tennessee blew out Virginia, and I was feeling really confident about my 10-2 pick for them. Then, after that, they had a very, very up-and-down clunky win against Austin Peay, and then immediately after that, they lost in the Swamp, which Florida is not really that great of a team. The Swamp is one of the tougher places to play, but that was definitely a winnable game. They went on to have a good season and finished off with a bright future as Nico Iamaleava, their true freshman 5-star recruit, led them to a shutout win in their bowl game over the offenseless Iowa Hawkeyes. Vanderbilt, here again. Some people were saying that their 2 conference wins last year would be kind of where they would be again this year because they weren't losing that much through the portal or they weren't losing that many guys to graduation. But gosh, it was a bad year for Vanderbilt. 2-10. I had them going 3-9. I didn't buy into the Vanderbilt hype and definitely shouldn't have, as they did not have a good season. Now they're losing their top 2 wide receivers. They're losing their quarterback to the portal. It's not going to get any better next year for the Commodores, and it may never, as the SEC just continues to get better and better and bring in harder and harder competition, and Vanderbilt's definitely the bottom of the SEC. But they've still got baseball to watch now. They've gotten through their tough part of the season. Now, after that, they can stop thinking about football. Yep, they're in the SEC now. Horns down. Texas is Texas. I think the Sooners, even though they did have just kind of as good of a year as I thought they would in the Big 12 in their final year, they're going to have a rude awakening to the SEC. Jackson Arnold may not be the play. Dylan Gabriel is a different story, but they're just losing a lot of guys to the portal, and it's going to be a little bit of a mess for Oklahoma. We thought it would be the other way around kind of going into this year, that Oklahoma would have a momentum swing and get back to dominating the Big 12 in 2023. And then in 2024, they would be ready to slide in to kind of that higher echelon of the SEC. And that Texas would be the one struggling and end up being at the back of the SEC for a few years. Now that has flipped. Texas is looking like, honestly, they're going to be pretty good. But Oklahoma, they might have a really bad year next year. And that's going to do it for this episode. This was a really fun one for me to make, so hopefully you guys like it, and hopefully we can continue this as a series where I look back at what I had said at the beginning of the season. Before we know it, it'll be time for me to make new predictions for next year. I'm hoping to make some new kind of content on this channel, and I hope you guys will be there for it. Be sure to like, be sure to subscribe, and thanks for tuning in. I might make another episode this week. Definitely trying to get them out faster and faster for you guys, and by letting me know that that's what I should be doing, just keep subscribing. Go follow me on Instagram at College Super Picks. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.